All right, cool.
Got that. And you all can see my managing user happiness.
Yes,
All right,
yes.
let's go this. To start, so first of all, thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are. And this is being recorded. So if you have any issues with being recorded, please, you can, if you don't want to be recorded, you can leave this meeting, but this will be available afterwards. So, okay. That said, let's talk about user experience. One of my favorite talks. The reason why I did this talk, I've done this talk multiple times, is because as developers, we listen to other developers, but will we listen to UX professionals? Probably not so much, because they're not developers. They don't understand the pains that we go through. So I was like, I got this. I'll be the bridge between the UX pros and my teams. But just so you know, starting out, I am not a graphics designer by any stretch of the imagination. I put colors together that have no business together. Quick story on that. So I've been doing web development since late 90s. HTML colors are my thing. Lemon chiffon and Dodger blue will tell you for sure that I've been there. Those are my go-to colors. So much so that I was teaching at a coding boot camp, and on my last day, they made a shirt for our cohort that represented them and included a blue, like a Dodger blue background with lemon chiffon for their design. It was great. I am notorious for those colors together, but they probably have no business together. You don't want me creating your graphics. I am a developer, I'm the architect type, but I am not a visually pleasing, which is weird because data visualizations are my thing too. But like putting colors together here, like Dodger blue, lemon chiffon, I think it's like a lavender and tomato, and the blue links on tomato. That's horrible stuff. Now, granted, this is beyond 20 years ago me who created this, but to this day, there's still times where I put colors like this together. I'm like, oh. As developers, we see our stuff and we're like, oh, this works on my machine. This is perfect. Our users are going to love this. This is going to be great. Just because it works on your machine doesn't mean it's going to work for your users. And just because you understand how your application works doesn't mean that your users will have that same understanding. So that whole works on my machine, just because it works there doesn't mean that the experience for your users are going to be the same. Now I know how developers are. I know how we get where we're like, well, but Sarah, works on my machine back when you started was old and didn't really work really well. But modern day works on my machine means we can ship my machine, right? We got containers. Really? I mean, I see this one coming a mile away. But no, you don't do works on my machine and ship your containers. That doesn't work. First of all, have you had to explain Docker Desktop to a non-developer? I have an IT pro husband. It doesn't get pretty at all when we talk about Docker. So yeah, shipping your containers, as long as you're the one doing the shipping or somebody who's professionally working with containers, it could be okay. But otherwise, that user experience gets even more complicated. Do you want your users to be in a complicated, nightmarish environment? No, none of us do. We want to create happy little user experiences. And yes, for you font snobs out there, that is Comic Sans. But then again, it's a happy font. Happy fonts and happy messages. Just like Bob Ross and his happy little trees, well, happy little user experiences. And we don't have to be professional designers to make this happen. Like I said, I can't create the initial vision. But now if a graphics designer gives me the vision, I can splice and dice and turn that into CSS easily. But otherwise, I am no designer by any stretch. Give me code, let me play, cool. Data structures, fine. Data architecture, sure. But colors, But we don't have to be like this. This is not who we have to be. In fact, we can just be a regular developer. And I'll show you in this talk some of the things that we need to consider through the software development lifecycle and the tools that are out there. They won't all be coding related, but they have the right conversations that get us there. But before we go anywhere, we need to all check our egos at the door. I need to remind you that our code is not reflecting on us as a person. You are not your code. It is not about you. So check that at the door. Your app is also not about you. Unless you are your sole user, it's not about you. It's about your users, and it's about how they perceive it, how they prefer to use it, and so many other things. So many people I talk to with user experience, well, I mean, let's go into the next few slides. So what is user experience? When I say user experience, what all do you think about? Feel free to come off mute and chime in.
Yeah, for me, it's user friendliness. A user has to use your app. That should be easy to use because my experience is otherwise they just don't use it. So
Mm-hmm.
that for me, that's very big one. Just has to be very user friendly.
Yep.
Yeah, I would say it's got to work first. So many things don't even work or work well, you know. That's like the first step, and sometimes I feel we don't even get there. Never mind like a nice experience, but yeah.
But Phil, that feature looks so pretty, but it doesn't work.
One of the first things I always think about is how much the user has to think when they're using your web UI. It was a book or something I read a while ago. It was called Don't Make Me Think, and it was essentially if your user has to stop and ponder like how to do something in your web app or whatever your UI you're in, then you've failed at the job of making it obvious. So
Yep.
that's kind of always the first question I ask myself.
That's exactly what I meant. Exactly what I meant.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're hitting all the right points. I mean, user experience, it's about your users. It's about the people who are using your application or your system, and there's so much to it. I mean, to the point where I'm getting creative with word art again, not a designer. But user experience, this is the one that phase that most people think of when I say user experience. It's when the people are using your application. What's their experience with it? And when I say application, I'm going to use it generally, but think of it as your web application or your desktop application or your mobile app or a system's, whatever your application is that has users. Whenever they're using your application, sure, that is part of user experience. And that's usually the first thing that comes to people's mind is, okay, how are they when they're using your application? But there's more to it. How do they feel about having to use your application? Are they excited that they get to open your application again because your application saves them so much time in a process or saves so much headache or opens another line of communication a lot easier for them? Does your application make life a lot easier that they're excited about it? Yes, let's go ahead. I'm going to open up Phil's app and I'm going to start doing some cool things. Or are they going to be like, oh, this app takes forever to load. And I know that I'm going to have to calculate some stuff. And why is that calculating engine getting hung up yet again? And sometimes it's the application itself, and sometimes it's the environment it's hosted in, and not enough resources. But you, as a developer, have to find a good way to account for that, just in case, because you want good user experiences. You want your users to be happy using your app, so that they tell other people, so that other people get excited about using your app, and then you get more users. Which, as a developer, that could be awesome having all these people using your app, but also a nightmare because now you have to support all of them. So, I mean, it's trade-offs, but in the end, you want people happy. You want to see that your code is solving problems and making lives easier. So, are they excited about it? When they're done using your app, how are they? Are they happy with it? Are they like, yes, I was able to get everything done, and now I have plenty of time to go and work on whatever else I needed to get done? Or are they going to be like, I was in the middle of using my app, I got interrupted, I was talking to so and so, and then I come back to the app, and now I lost all my context, and I have no idea what I'm doing, and this app doesn't help me at all. That could be a thing. So the after could be after their whole experience, their whole experience, or it could be after a part of the experience. So they might have a big process that they need to do in your application and find an interrupted period. That gets to get tricky then. User experience includes perception. So how do your users perceive your application? We as developers get a mindset and we have ideas of our own on how our application will be used. And we have ideas of our own of how our application should be used. Like what problems does it solve and what should you use these fields for? These kinds of things. But your users might be like, oh, you know what? That name field, we don't need to use it as a name field. We're going to use it as some other thing. And then you're just like, why? Because that's what our users do. Users will see an application and they'll make it fit for their needs, sometimes even if it isn't meant to fit their needs. How do they perceive it? How do they choose to use it? Preferences are also part of the user app experience. So when you think of the preferences of your user, it's a weird one because how do your users prefer to use your application? Are there particular times of day where they prefer to use it? Like I have a social media app that I prefer to use in the morning when I'm not distracted. But then in the afternoon, I'm getting too many distractions, so I can't stay focused enough to get through the process. So that could be a preference. Do they prefer a light theme versus maybe a dark theme? What about a solarized theme or some other theme altogether? Or can they customize their UI for their own theme? These are preferences that are part of the user experience that can make or break a app. For example, for me, most often I can't do dark themes because they hurt my eyes, like the contrast is too much. But I can't do their quote unquote light themes because they're a white background and that's just too bright. So I usually look for a solarized thing. So for me, I can tell personally that preferences do make a difference because if it doesn't support it, I don't want to hurt my eyes more than I need to. So emotions. So emotions are also part of your user experience. How do they feel? And their beliefs can impact their user experience as well. So do they believe in doing things a particular way? Do they believe in doing things only on certain days? How does that impact your app? All of these together make up user experience. These also make up user experience. So these are the key things we look out for. We talk about things where we've got the look and feel, but then there's also the usability. So the UI, is it consistent? Are you using the same words in processes over and over? Using them consistently is one thing. The other thing is, are they meaning the exact same thing? Or are you saying that this is a review for like a code review versus this is a review for some other kind of review? Like I was in a group talking with them about reviews and they're like, hold up, what do you mean? And I'm like, uh-oh, we need to establish context, which I have a few slides later will show you why context is crucial. But consistency, not just in using the same words, but consistency in meanings as well, is crucial. The visually appealing, that goes back to the comment I made to Phil, but that feature looks so pretty. The UI, the looks, sure. But then there's this usability thing, which Phil's pointed out, which is it's got to work. It's got to be functional. There have been many times where I've worked with junior developers who are like, oh yeah, look at this app. This is cool. Look at this search thing. I'm like, that's just a search box. They're like, yeah. I'm like, all right, so if I start typing, oh yeah, that part is still broken. Are you delivering a design or are you delivering functionality? Which is it? And does the design make sense without the functionality? Because if it's just going to have a user frustrated that that search box is there and I can type in it, but it's not going to search anything, now my user experience is through the roof frustration because I was expecting search to actually work. I don't want a cool search box with a magnifying glass if it doesn't actually do searching. So that functional part, just because it looks pretty, it doesn't mean anything. It also has to work. Is it intuitive? Does it make sense naturally? And if you're not sure, ask other people around you who may be able to spot check in, like, does this really make sense? Maybe, because there are times too where thoughts make sense in our heads and you go and you implement it and then people are like, this doesn't make sense. What am I missing here? And so then you have to have that conversation of, okay, what did I forget? What isn't intuitive about it? What isn't predictable? So if you were to drop your user into the app today, no training, no manuals, no videos to help them, can they guess how your UI is going to work? That's your intuitive, that's your predictable. If they can't do either of those, we have to ask, why are you making it more complex than it needs to be? All right. And then feeling, of course, we get into the emotions, beliefs. You hope that you don't hit the physically and psychologically feels, but there have been apps that can get that elevated. And again, that goes back to the before and after of how do they feel? And are they going to get angry? Are they going to be mad and not recommend your app and uninstall it and then write a scathing blog post to say, don't use this app and here's why? Or are they maybe the other extreme of, this app is so awesome, I need to tell the whole world about it. Then they start making videos and content and stuff like that and talking well about it. You want the goodness to be spread. You don't want the anger to spread, but you have to be aware that both of those are capable, and the grayscale in between as well. All right. So developing, how does user experience factor into the software development lifecycle? So I'm going through the lifecycle where we have, hold on, show it. There it is. The analyze, design, development, testing, finalize circle. And the reason why I went with that one is just because those phases made sense. But we'll start with analyzing. So as developers, we need to make sure we kind of have a better understanding of the problem before we try to write the code. Because so often we go and jump into code like, I got an idea, let me go ahead and do this. And it's nowhere near what the customer wanted because you didn't get the full story. So for user experience in the analyze phase, there are various things you can do. Some of the things you'll see here include field research. So going out in the field where your users are going to be using your application, learning what they do, learning more about the problems that they're having so that you understand what you're trying to solve. The reason why you do something like field research is because now you have context around your users in addition to the story of, you know, I just need an application where I can enter in more details about my collection. Okay, what does that look like? Well, you don't know that they're actually entering details in between customer transactions. So an interrupted user experience, what does that look like? You don't know that though unless you do the research. So field research is something that happens to help with capturing context. Face-to-face interviewing, we'll talk about some of these here in the upcoming slides, but just so you're aware that when you're going through the analysis of the problem, you need to have these conversations. I don't think I can stress that enough. The conversations that you have will help you to have a better understanding, which means it gets you closer to developing a solution that will solve the actual problem. Because sometimes you're going to have those conversations and realize that it's not even a code problem. It's a communications problem, or it's a missing resource problem. But you have to have conversations. Put yourself in your user's shoes. If you can, do that field research. Figure out what it is that's going on around them when they're using your application. Find out what it is. Maybe it's the problem that you're trying to solve stresses your users out. And it just happens to be 5, 10, 15 years of dealing with the same problems over and over that they've now got an ingrained anxiety that, oh no, I gotta go deal with the situation again. Anxiety is shooting through the roof. That happens. So now you have to deal with, oh, how do I train them into new habits? And how do we develop applications that work well so that maybe their anxiety levels won't be as high coming into this process? Mind maps are a wonderful thing for just doing brain dumps. That's how I think of them. This particular example, I was dealing with creating applications for children and creating flashcards. And so trying to break down the different categories and what did that look like. So mind maps allow you to get an idea of what your customer or client wants in the application or what they want in the solution. Or you can even just do problem mapping. So you're mapping out keywords that you notice in the problem and then chaining off of there, like, oh, well, they have this particular issue with billing, for example. Is it all billing? No, it's only certain invoices. And it's like, oh, okay. And so then you start tracking it down. Mind maps can help with those kinds of situations. Now, if you're in the web side of things, sitemaps help too. DevIQ happens to be one of the sites that I help with here at Nimble Pros. And so trying to get my head around the site and understanding it, I drew a sitemap. Now, sitemaps you can see similar to mind maps, or you may see them similar to like a directory tree structure or a hierarchy. But again, what does this have to do with user experience? The way you organize your data, the way you organize your navigation can make or break a user experience. The unfinished search thing that I mentioned earlier happens. I've seen that enough. But then looking at the organization of, okay, we have these different categories. Now, what if I want to add testing? Well, where do I put that in navigation? Well, that doesn't fit in here. So then we look at that sitemap and we have that conversation of, okay, testing will go, maybe it's a new top level one, or maybe we bury it on another category that makes sense. But we couldn't have that conversation without drawing it out and having it. So mind maps and sitemaps allow you to get out of your head with just conceptual ideas and talking through it. Personas. So the story I have about this, I was working on a city planning commission for a city website, and we were trying to identify who were going to be our website visitors. And so I was like, well, hold up. Like, I'm the only techie on this crew. Let's talk about the best way to go into this, which is understanding who's visiting your website so you know what information you have. And they were like, oh yeah. Like, so we'll create some what we call personas, or ideal people who would visit the site. And so I pointed out things like, well, we'll have business owners who'll come to the city's website and want to know things like, are there incentives for business owners to move their business into the city? Or the tax structure, because businesses have to understand the tax structure for cities, at least here in Ohio. I'm sure it is like that in similar places as well. So on the website, what is the business owner looking for? For the older residents who are actually hitting the website, they're going to wonder things like, is there a senior center? Are there activities for seniors? They may be curious about things like the healthcare system, or maybe they're new and they want to know about other like organizations. There's things like Rotary and other groups and such that they can get involved with as well. And then the younger resident, and that was ages ago, that baby is now almost 12. So at the time I was just like, well, hold up, as parents, we're going to have questions too, like what's the safety of the city? And what's the school system like? And how does that work for their preschool programs? How young does it go? Then there was also the question of Parks and Rec and what kind of services are offered there. We ended up creating these personas to help us understand and remember who's coming to our website. This goes for your applications as well. Who's using your web application? Sometimes you may not know who's visiting your site, so you have a generic user, but sometimes you may have a general persona. So in this case, a business owner. Now, I don't know who these people are for my characters named Jose and Irene. They have names so that we could personify them, even though they weren't actual people in our city. But then this was an actual picture of me because I was a resident of the city. When you can personify your personas, it kind of makes it a little more personal for you to go, oh, okay. Well, we have Jose, the business owner. If I were Jose, what would I want to see? What does he need to have in order to be successful in the city? So having personas makes you think about, okay, as a business owner, when I go to a city website, what kind of things do I expect to see? I might look to see for, like I said, city incentives for businesses to move in. So that's what personas do. They help you to understand who are your users and what needs do they have. Flowcharts. This flowchart was doing some kind of game thing, but whenever you're talking processes, flowcharts are great for understanding your domain a bit better and understanding your user experience. Because when you map out the process, you can also then identify pain points like, oh, this doesn't work well, and here's why. It also gets people on the same page as you do a flowchart, because then you all can look at the steps and go, this makes sense, or hold up, we have a problem right here with this display an error. Why are we displaying an error so early? What happened? Maybe we need to have more clear messaging here on this page where we tell them that they can't hit this condition. So being explicit and telling people the expectations of input are crucial for user experience. Set the expectations ahead of time. Now, domain storytelling is another thing we can use in the analyze phase. So understanding the situation, understanding our users, and having our users talk through again the process and understanding it. So this is one I use for signing up for our webinars. And we actually have a webinar on domain storytelling that I'll include in our links in the thank you email. But this is, again, another technique that you can use to have those conversations, to understand your users better, to maybe create their experiences in a way that will make this less painful. Event storming is another one we have a webinar for as well, that this happens in the analyze phase. This is in the understanding the problem. This is the going through and mapping out a process. That's what those orange things are. This is what happened. The yellows are who's impacted. The pinks are the systems that are impacted that are in there. So for e-commerce, for example, you might have payment systems, you might have tax systems or shipping and logistics systems, things like that. And then you have the pain points, or sometimes called the hotspots. So when we do event storming, I like to use this, thanks to Ardalis for recommending it to me, because it does call out the pain points in a way that's noticeable. But again, this requires you having people in the room to have the conversation, to understand a domain, to understand a business area, to understand the problem that's happening. You have those conversations, then you use sticky notes to have a visual of what you understand. That way you build a shared understanding. You also start to build knowledge together in a language base called a ubiquitous language, where everybody, technical and non-technical, can use the same terms and know what the other person is talking about. All right, so that's in the analyze phase. When it comes to user experience in the design phase, there's a lot more things that go on, but the key thing I want to point out to you is going to be prototyping in the interface design. We'll also talk about feature writing and requirement writing, but I'm going to focus on prototyping first because of this. Even if you have drawing skills that you're like, I'm a horrible artist. Hi, that's me. It helps to be able to draw low fidelity mockups so that you can just on the fly have a conversation and draw on the back of a napkin, draw on just a random sheet of paper that you happen to grab from a printer somewhere, but be able to draw out some ideas. So back in 2016, there was a conference called Code Mash. It happens in the second week of January every year. They happen to have a 4-hour workshop called a UX Jam, a user experience jam. It was run by user experience professionals who I later talked to afterwards. So this presentation has already been screened by UX professionals and we've exchanged notes on it. So yes, this is UX for developers by a developer who talks to UX professionals. But we did a learn to sketch exercise as part of this workshop. And the whole reason is so that you get comfortable drawing these things out. And as you can see, I'm not the greatest of artists, but I at least attempted it. So yeah, there are low fidelity drawings that you will see. And sometimes you have to just understand that you're trying to understand your users. Sometimes you don't have your computer handy, you just have to draw it out. This was a contact form that I drew out. I was like, I need it nice and simple. I mentioned I'm not the greatest of drawing. But the other thing to note too is when you're doing these kind of wireframes and prototypes, you want them low fidelity, because the last thing you want is a high fidelity prototype and now your users like, or your clients are like, okay, that looks really nice. Now that you've got the design part done, can it be done by next week? Oh, the expedited timeline because the prototype looks too nice. If you want to try to avoid that. So that's why I'm an advocate for the low fidelity mockups or the low fidelity wireframes, because you don't want to get yourself in a situation where your client's like, hey, that looks pretty and can I have it? All right. How are we doing chat? Okay, so far? Okay. And if you have any questions as I'm going through, please come off mute and ask. All right, so wireframes, this allows us to draw out the applications or the dashboards or whatever that they're going through. Now I happen to notice on this screenshot right here, we have the bad and good. And it's just that good. Avoid that. So that's a bad user experience because you can't read your labels on top of your data. But yeah, having these kind of mock-ups is good again for having conversations and understanding. Well, if I do my layout like this where I have the 3 columns on the right, does that make sense for my users? Does that make sense for whoever's looking at this? Does it make sense for marketing who's going to inevitably be like, you know, that design? All right, in 6 months, we're going to flip it all upside down. So having these conversations with wireframes like this where you could draw it out helps. The other thing I want to point out is the text. So we have in here our lorem ipsum, which is our standard placeholder text. You don't have to be stuck with lorem ipsum. There's a website out there called Pan Ipsum, which allows you to choose different themes for your ipsum text. So think of ipsum text as a placeholder, but if you can get something on theme, that makes it a little more relatable. Again, visual communication helps. A Lucidchart, so Lucidchart actually has mobile mockups as well. So if you're a mobile developer and you have to deal with things like iPhones and iOS and Android, they have the mockups there so you can actually make your wireframes using those. Balsamic is another one that I like for doing hand-drawn wireframes, or I use hand-drawn loosely in this case because you can do, it's a style where it looks more drawn than it does actually polished. So you can get a general idea. For this particular one, I was running a website keeping track of all the tech events in the area. So I wanted to make sure we talk through, okay, does it make sense? What do I need to show for an event? Well, if I need to add an event, I want the name. This is the, hey, I should probably have a calendar controlled because calendar controls make it easier, but also make sure that they have the ability to type in the date because from a user experience point of view, how often do you want to select versus, okay, if it's tomorrow, fine. But if it's so far in the future, I don't want to have to keep clicking. Just let me type in the date. And then there's a location as well. And then a maps thing, so I could show where is that event happening. Again, having the ability to just kind of draw out and get it out of my head and run it by users like, okay, I'm not the only one adding events to the site. Let's run it by them to see, does this make sense? Am I missing anything? And that goes back to the whole checking your egos at the door. It's okay to miss a feature. It's okay to miss a detail. It's even better when you say to somebody else, what am I missing? Because you have to understand there are things that we know. There are things we know we don't know. And then there's that other stuff way out there. The stuff that we don't know because we don't even know it exists. Somebody else, though, does. And so that's why we seek feedback. All right, I mentioned that writing feature files are also part of the design phase. This is using the syntax known as Cucumber, and this is used for automating tests for user acceptance. And use my laser pointer again on this. So we have this feature scenario keywords. Feature is just describing what piece of the application that we want to test. There really isn't a lot of structure to a feature part, but your structure is in your scenario. So given, when, then are the keywords that you follow through here. Now, I have a whole other workshop that I can do with teaching people this, but the thing to note about this is it opens up communications early on in the design phase before you've written code. So now you'll be able to write code to make this happen. And if you do TDD, if you do test-driven development, now you're only writing the code to pass the tests. You're not going to do the bells and whistles that would be nice to have because you ain't going to need it. We have principles for that. That's called you ain't going to need it. But when you do something like this where you gather your requirements into feature files and then you have acceptance tests, now you know exactly what you're looking for. You have things explicitly stated. All right, so we've gone through analyze and design. Let's go through the development phase. When it comes to user experience in the development phase, there are things that we as developers can do that'll make our users' lives a lot easier. But the things we have to keep in mind, be explicit with the understanding that the user, first of all, has no idea necessarily what you're requiring. So if, for example, you're dealing with a form and taking on details, let's say for an example, you have something where you're tracking a user and all their different social media accounts, and they're all optional. And then you add another one and you're like, oh, I forgot to specify that that one is optional. make sure if something is required, put the asterisk or put required out there. If some field needs so many different requirements, we're talking passwords here, be explicit up front rather than letting your users type in a password only to find out that there's more rules that they didn't know about. So be very clear, be explicit in the expectations that the users should have, or be explicit in the expectations that you have for your application and its inputs. And be consistent. Use the terms repeatedly with the same meaning repeatedly. Context. Context is very important. So I got a story. How many of you excited to hear you've won the lottery? This is awesome. We won the lottery. Woohoo! Right? Except not all lotteries are ones you want to win. This is a lottery you don't want to win. So I worked in manufacturing and I was working for HR at the time. There was a project I was dealing with for HR where we had to deal with drug testing, and there are certain algorithms that they needed implemented for choosing the people for their drug test. And so we always would say, hey, look, they won the lottery because, well, the algorithm chose them. So context is important. This message sounds awesome, but then when you see what you won, not so awesome. Be clear as to what your context is. Be clear as to what the expectations are. In this particular example, the reason why I like using this particular screenshot is because those number formats are not necessarily what we're used to seeing on the US side of things, but you see these formats in the European side. So you see that the periods and the commas are reversed than what the US would expect, but would make more sense on the European side. When you're dealing with your application, again, knowing your users and knowing their locale, or knowing that you have to support multiple locales is important, because you need to know how things are going to translate. You're going to need to know how things line up. You need to know that it's going to make sense, because the last thing you want to do is show something like this to the US side that's not used to using it like this. The periods and commas will trip their mind up. The user experience gets confusing. But then when you show it to the European side, they're like, oh yeah, we got this. This makes sense. This is awesome. I can follow this report just fine. This example uses a report. Whether you're doing an application, whether you're doing reporting, whatever your artifacts are that you're working with that users have to interact with, you need to consider the user experience part as you're developing it to make sure it makes sense. Context, again, matters in terms of understanding, do you have a user who is focused when they're using your application? Or are they like this lady who's distracted? She's trying to juggle two conversations. Somebody's taking notes for her. Somebody else is making sure she has water. She's got way too many distractions. If she's using your application, she's going to be in there a split second and right back out. Again, understanding your users, understanding their context will help you in deciding, okay, you know what, this application with this really long process, I need to make sure that it supports microtransactions, little steps along the way so that they can be interrupted. Do they need to look deeper into a report? So making sure that you have all the details, again, understanding your user, understanding their experience, and do they need that stuff right there, or do you put it somewhere else? Like, how do you make it so that the data is accessible in a way that they can easily work with it? Do they work in a shop environment? So the story with this is, think of it where you have an application where they have to, maybe they're tracking parts in a manufacturing environment and they have to scan a barcode to say, hey, it's at this location. And maybe your scanner isn't working. So now you have scanner issues in addition to trying to work with your application. Well, is the scanner the problem? Is it your application the problem? Is the scanner sending bad information to your application? And when it does that, how does it impact your user? Do you tell your user that there's a scanner issue? Do you tell your user something technical accidentally? Because that happens as devs, where we put technical stuff into our error messages and then we're like, wait, that doesn't really help our users. You have to consider the environments, you have to consider your users when you're showing these things, you have to consider their environment and the tools that they're using. Contextual help, I can't stress this enough. This was taken from a website who has been blanked out on purpose. And this was many years ago that I did this site. I think they've fixed it, but when I first did this presentation, they're like, oh, wait, what? Be explicit in your messaging. So I'm looking at the site and I'm going, okay, my password needs to be a minimum of 8 characters and it must contain 2 numbers. This should be straightforward, right? They set out their explicit understanding, or so I thought. Nope, there are more rules that I didn't know about as a user. So I could see that it had to have special characters and only A to Z numbers are allowed. Could you have told me that in the first place so I could have actually given you the right input the first time? That's when I say your contextual help needs to be very explicit early on. Your users do not want to get in this state of invalid forms. That's not what they're going for. Yeah, and Scott, you're right. These surprise password requirements happen more often than they should. Just be explicit. And I understand that there are password policies that are too long to fit just one line, but still be explicit. Put that paragraph above your passwords. That way you set that expectation. Yeah, paragraphs are gross for passwords, but I'd rather see the paragraph, or better yet, list items. List each of the requirements out that way. Just make it easy for them. All right, useless errors. I mean, this is another one. I love this part of the presentation. Talk about useless errors. Blue screens. As a general user, when I see a blue screen, I'm just like, okay, at this point, I don't know what it is. I'm just going to go ahead and reboot. As a developer, those stop codes mean something, or more as an IT professional, those stop codes mean something that I can go ahead and search for those and figure out what some of this stuff means. But if I were just in plain old user mode and not my technical self, I would be like, I don't know what this means. I see it says something about press F8, but honestly, let me just reboot and it'll fix itself. Yeah, that's what our users do. When it's too complicated, when they feel like you're talking over their head, they're going to panic. That's a bad user experience. You don't want that. In addition, on this particular one, what's a problem is that it talks about things like, if the screen appears again, follow these steps. But I see paragraphs after that. Could you call the steps out numbered? Could you call them out in a way that's not so hard for me to process? Whereas with a paragraph, you have to stop and read everything. Make it easy for your users to understand. The other useless errors, though, that you don't want to do, don't do an error has occurred. What am I going to do with that as a user? There's nothing. But then the stack traces too, don't put those in the user view for error messages. Your users are not going to be debugging your code. You can put it in logger messages and then look at the logs. That is beautiful. But showing that to your users, come on guys, that's gross. Don't do that. Seriously, make your user error messages more friendly. As Tim suggested earlier when we asked, what is user experience? User friendliness is a part of it. And especially when things are going wrong, you want to make sure that your user understands what happened, but not in a way where it's scary. When it comes to errors, you have the useless errors, but then sometimes you have the actionable errors too. Chrome is one I like to point out because when it has an error, it's usually good about having that detail section. And so when you open up the detail section, they give you steps on what you can try. And it's written in a way that's easy to follow. So actionable error messages, I like that because now as a user, I'm not left hanging and I'm not like, okay, this is broken, I can't use this anymore, close the app and walk away. The problem I have with this particular error is that maybe it's too actionable. Don't get me wrong, the dinosaur game can be a fun distraction, but that's exactly what it is. It's a distraction. So as a user, you might be like, oh, okay, fine, I'll play the dinosaur game until my connection comes back to the internet. Or you could have just gone downstairs, restarted your router, your internet's back up, and you're back to work again. The gamer in me, as much as I like playing games, we still got to get stuff done. So a little too actionable when it comes to the game. Make sure you check the details. For user experience as developers, we also need to consider things like contextual backgrounds. The reason why I point this particular one out, this is using one of the other CSS libraries, but the thing we had to pay attention to was we have success has got a green background. Okay, that makes sense. Danger has a pink background. Okay, warning, on the other hand, does not have a colored background at all. So that blends in with regular text. That's a problem. So if you're going to use contextual backgrounds, make sure that there's something there that indicates the context. So you can use the keywords, like explicitly say danger in this case, or include the word success somewhere. Even though this text says this is a warning with contextual backgrounds, as a regular user, they would see the text as plain formatting and not be alarmed. But if they need to be warned, then you need to have a better style behind that. And so as developers during the development phase, we can edit our CSS as needed and make sure to kind of keep these things in there. Like, am I calling enough attention to this danger spot? Okay. So now let's talk about fonts in terms of user experience, and you're usually doing this during the development part. Because design, they get all sketchy, but development, that's where we implement it. If you are going to convey a message, the font choice makes an important difference. Serious messages need serious fonts. Like the happy little trees, that's a happy message. I can get away with Comic Sans. But your dog has died of dysentery in Comic Sans? Death messages in Comic Sans just don't line up. I have a sad message to tell you, but a happy font? That doesn't work. Or there's also Papyrus. Your dog has died of dysentery and Papyrus, coming soon to an Avatar movie near you. No, 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 no. This is, again, not the right kind of font to tell that kind of thing. You need something a little more serious. Okay, your dog has died of dysentery in a more serious looking font. You're breaking the news in a way that somebody could actually process it. Now, I apologize to any of you here or in the recording who see this and have a dog. Your dog really hasn't died of dysentery. This is just a statement of fact to set up for this. For the Oregon Trail players out there of dying of dysentery ages ago. Here lies your dog, they died of dysentery. So the right font to use for something like that would be more something like Oregon Trail. But again, this goes to show sad messages do not use happy fonts. Happy messages don't use sad fonts, don't use scary fonts. Use a font that's going to evoke the right emotion for the message you're trying to tell. When it comes to doing data visualizations in your development, you also want to choose the right visualizations. Because again, user experience for visualizations matters. So if you're dealing with things like percentages, when it clearly adds up to 100% and the pie slices are various sizes and not indistinguishable, pie charts have a place, but there are also other visualizations out there. So use the visualization that makes sense for the story that they're trying to tell. Now these are, again, hand-drawn, low fidelity, just to show that, hey, by the way, low fidelity is a thing when you're having that conversation. So, the other things that we talk about during the development phase are usable documentation. Documentation, I know as developers, it's the last thing we want to have to work with unless we have code that'll work with us, like Swagger and generate the documents for me, sure. But the documentation is part of our development phase. It's when that stuff's getting created. I'm going to call out twit.tv specifically because they use a API that the user experience from a developer perspective, I get excited about. And the reason for that is because of this. So we have on their website, and I'm going to just stick to the slides for now, just because we're short on time, but they have the ability to switch to a console. And then you can see that they also talk about an example. So right now as a developer, I'm excited because I can either play with it or I can see a different example. I can look at a production, or I can look at, I think there's a staging environment. There are other environments I can try this against. I can take a look at the different output types, but then I could try. And the different languages that you use, it'll have the syntax for you with the code. So you don't have to go, okay, how do I do this again in my language of choice? It's got the recommended approaches on here. From a user experience point of view, if your audience is developers, giving them a playground to play in helps, because it helps them to want to play it with it and try it out before they adopt it. And this was just showing a couple of different languages. So previous was Ruby, this is Perl. And then this is what they have in the console, so you could actually see what it looks like and play around with it some more. But again, having actionable documentation can help to gain your users buy-in, which is important. All right, 2 more things. So we have the testing section and then finalizing and evolution. So when you're getting to testing with the user experience, if you remember earlier, we talked about gathering the requirements into what they call the features. This is what it looks like when you're trying to automate it. So this is SpecFlow, which I'll include a link to the webinar for that as well. But this walks you through given, when, then, and now you have automated accepted tests, which is nice from a developer standpoint, because now you have code that is ensuring that it's operating the way that it's expected. And something like SpecFlow can actually help generate the code for you, so it's a little bit easier nowadays. The tooling's nicer. And you'll see this is something that, like, the generated steps for it. So when it comes to testing, this is where you're going to start adding like your automation for your requirements. When you're doing testing, you can also have your Google Analytics, for example, or some kind of analysis and understanding this. This helps you during testing for user experience, because now you're understanding how are people using your application. From a web perspective especially, I would want to know, how are they getting to my website? So search engine traffic sources would be awesome. I want to know what browsers they're using, because I want to know which functionality I can implement and know that I'm not going to break it for my end users. If anybody's using IE6, we need to talk. It's long dead. All right, evolution and finalize. So this is where you get to have your app released, and now your users can give you feedback. App analytics are there to help give you the metrics for how they're using your application once it's in the wild, but I want to focus on gathering feedback. Allow your users to give you feedback so you can better understand their user experience of your application, and give them multiple ways to submit that feedback. So for example, this was part of Visual Studio feedback at one point, where we could give them smileys and frowns, or the send a smiles. But then there are also other ways to deal with this. And yes, even though it looks like you just fill this and it goes to the void, there are humans who are looking at the feedback. And occasionally I'd get a message like, hey, we saw that and we're actually working on it. So give your users the ability to tell you what works and what doesn't work. Submitting bugs, requesting missing features. Your users have opinions about the application. Let them talk about that. Let them give you that feedback so you can grow from it and hopefully get them to get more excited about your app. This was another approach where they had a feedback button and we could put information here. Notice here in the placeholder text, they're very explicit. Don't include personal info like your name or email address. Again, that goes back to the whole user experience and being explicit, and tell them what you're expecting here. Now, this is a this is a feedback that I'm going to warn you on. Be careful with the feedback systems you choose, and choose one that actually makes sense. So smiley faces and frowny faces, we get that. That's emotion. That makes sense. But minus, plus, plus, plus. Wait a minute. Plus, minus? Who wrote this scale? This is a scale, hopefully no longer in use. This is an older screenshot, but when I first saw it, I'm like, not everybody would intuitively understand why this is, and this is just a strange rating system. Use rating systems that make sense, or be explicit in why you chose them. All right, so how do you get the user feedback? These are some tools to do that. So user voice, SurveyMonkey, Google. I use MailChimp to do surveys. I've worked with a company up in Michigan who uses Optimal Workshop. They were doing a user research thing and had me help them with that. Make sure that they can have the ability to report problems as well. So here at Nimble Pros, between the stuff we work on and the stuff that Ardalis does that we support as well. So he'll talk about something like Ardalis's guard clauses. You'll see we blog about these things. He has the ability you all can file issues when you use his issue or use his libraries. So give them the ability to give that feedback. Step recorder. This is another way to get user feedback, having them record their steps along the way. Having customer engagements, again, experiencing what the user experiences in their environment helps to give you more context. These are some prototyping tools. Don't panic at the end of this webinar. Once our recording is available, I will be sending you an email with all these different links, plus the links to the recording, so that you have these for further reference. But these are some of the prototyping tools that we've recommended. Balsamiq, I use Miro, the second one, often, more often than anything, honestly. But they're all great tools for prototyping. When it comes to fonts and icons, the Noun project is my go-to for icons. And that's just, again, a decent collection of icons. But these are also other things that are out there. Google Fonts is what I go to for fonts, mostly because they have a great preview system as well. Some other tools to just know about. So egon.io is what I use for domain storytelling. That's the animated one that you saw. I created it with egon.io. Mermaid.js, so being a developer, I have to work in a bunch of JavaScript-based blogs. And so writing my blog content is in Markdown, and they actually have support for Mermaid in some of them. And so I use Mermaid to draw diagrams and charts, so class diagrams and sequence diagrams, in addition to some Git charts and other things like that. Again, having the user experience and being able to draw out the experience for people to see them. Canva and Figma are some tools for collaborating on designs. Adobe Color, I've been using Adobe Color for a long time now. Before it was even Adobe, it was cooler. So color.adobe.com. When you're trying to figure out what colors actually belong together, not Dodger blue and lemon chiffon, but actual colors that belong together, Adobe Color has great recommendations for that. These are some of the books. So I know we mentioned earlier, someone talked about Don't Make Me Think. Don't Make Me Think Revisited is the latest version of that one. The Design of Everyday Things. This is a classic for understanding UX. About Face is good when it's talking about the user experience and the interaction design. There's a couple more books in here that I recommend that people are like, but UX? I'm like, but the tools that we deal with. So domain storytelling is the whole concept in their book. Dan Rome's Show and Tell. That book is the reason why you see my bad drawings now in these webinars. It's because you need to be able to tell the story. And he has a book called The Back of the Napkin as well. But how do you tell that story? And this was a book that was recommended to me by a gentleman named David Neal, who I know from the developer community. He does a lot of drawings. I asked him, I was like, how did you get the confidence to get into drawings and hand drawing all your slides? And he pointed me to the Dan Rome's book. So I share that with everyone. I have it on my bookshelf behind me as well. And then the non-designer's design book, for those of us who are not designers by trade, we definitely want to have a copy of that on hand to understand more design principles in a way that we understand it. And if you do anything with data visualizations, I highly recommend Tufts series. His envisioning information is also good from a user experience point. There's additional websites that I'll send as well, and additional resources too, so you can see more about these tools that are there. If you have any questions, feel free to either come off mute, or when I send the email out, feel free to drop an email in a response. All those emails that you send in response to the thank you email come directly to me.
Short question, Sarah.
Sure.
Is it okay that I share these recordings with my teammates in
Sure.
our? Yeah, it's a small team of developers, but It's no problem if I upload this video to our Teams
I was gonna
channel.
say you can share the video with them, but you can have them sign up. So by the end of today, I'll have a link for the recording
Yeah.
out so that if people want to sign up for the recording after the fact, and then also have links to the other webinars. That would help too. Or if the email that I send for thank you, if you want to share that with your teammates, that would probably
Okay,
be the better way to do it.
I'll definitely do that. Yeah, I'll
Yeah, 'cause
definitely do that too.
Those
Yeah.
emails have the links that you see in the presentation.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Sure. All right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, like I said, I'll send an email probably end of today or first thing tomorrow morning with all the links, as well as the link to the recording once it's available. And then if you have any questions, feel free to respond to that email. Those emails, like I said, come right back to me. So I'll do what I can to answer questions. All right, well, thank you so much for coming and attending this webinar today, and I hope to see you at future webinars. Thank you.
Bye.